talk draws on ideas from my new book, Soundtrack to a Movement, which I will mention it's unbelievable to me that was recently announced by the American Association of American Publishers as a finalist for their Prose Award in the music and performing arts category. And I'll begin with a few ideas from the book, and then we can have some good discussion. And I understand you're reading my first book, so ask me questions about my first book if you wish to. On March 8th, 1965, 2 weeks after Malcolm X's assassination, tenor saxophonist Archie Shepp recorded Malcolm, Malcolm, Semper Malcolm, a tribute to his hero's revolutionary political consciousness. It was also included on his album Fire Music. Shepp, who had played with John Coltrane on several albums, identified a continuity between Coltrane's music and Malcolm's speeches. He said, and I'm quoting him, "I equate Coltrane's music very strongly with Malcolm's language. They were just about contemporaries. And I believe essentially what Malcolm said is what John played. If Train had been a speaker, he might have spoken somewhat like Malcolm. If Malcolm had been a saxophone player, he might have played somewhat like Train." End of quote. Unlike Malcolm X, noted jazz saxophonist and composer John Coltrane did not identify himself as a Black revolutionary. Although, as we will see a little later in this talk, he was noted by his wife for attending Malcolm X's speeches in the 1960s, anytime he had the opportunity to do so, and did admit his great admiration for Malcolm X's political ideas. Archie Shepp was not the only one to note the parallels between Coltrane's music and Malcolm's politics. As trumpeter Miles Davis pointed out, Train's music during the last 2 years of his life represented for many Blacks the fire and passion and rage and rebellion and love they felt, especially among the young Black intellectuals and revolutionaries at that time. He was their torchbearer in jazz. Malcolm X and John Coltrane were two of the leading stars in what I have called the golden age of African American Islam and jazz. My book explores the historical connections between jazz, African American Islam, and Black internationalism from about the 1940s to the 1970s. It shows that from the late 1940s, the post-World War II period, through the Black Power movement, Islam rose in prominence among African Americans, in part for reasons that were related to the embrace of the religion among jazz musicians. The rise of Black Islam is most often framed in relationship to the Nation of Islam, and often we hear about how prison experiences, like that of Malcolm X, were instrumental in spreading Islam among African American communities. That was certainly a part of the story. But this book sets out to show that the golden age of jazz music was instrumental in shaping Black encounters with Islam, and that not only the Nation of Islam, but other communities of the religion were involved in this influential interplay between religion and culture. Islam in the African American experience argues that the values that Islam and jazz shared were key to the growth of African American Islamic communities, and that it was jazz musicians who led the way in shaping many encounters with Islam as they developed what I call a Black Atlantic coup that shaped both religion and jazz styles, as well as new notions of Black masculinity and femininity. Jazz musicians even used their participation in America's Cold War diplomacy cultural programs to foster connections between jazz, Islam, and Black internationalism in the United States and in the Third World. Through their efforts, Islam became a prominent theme in the US State Department jazz tours, beginning in the Cold War and continuing up to the civil rights and Black Power movements in the 1960s. African American Islam and jazz share the parallel goals and values of Black affirmation, freedom, and self-determination. Black followers of Islam and jazz musicians express these values by rejecting systemic racism, constructing new notions of gender, and developing a sense of Black internationalism. The term Black internationalism in this study refers to a global Black religious consciousness and interconnected resistance movements that led African Americans to think universally about their struggles for freedom. As a middle of the 20th century approach, they began to see themselves in a larger global context as part of the worldwide liberation struggles of Blacks in the African diaspora and Africa, and also sometimes in solidarity with the oppositional struggles of people of color who are not Black. During this period, Blacks in the United States exemplified the growing trend of religious internationalism and developed a new sense of self in which they embraced spiritual and musical experimentation and constructed religious and racial identities, musical styles, and political protest movements against the background of this rising Black internationalism. This resulted in the contemporaneous development of global diaspora consciousness connecting people of African descent. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, Black jazz artists experimented with new musical forms, religious identities, and ideas about freedom that appealed to their fans who were Northern Blacks, Southern migrants, and Caribbean immigrants in African American communities in these places. These musicians' solidarity with the Muslim religion was one of the ways in which they expressed the jazz world's relationship to Black internationalism. While World War II was being fought in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, the leaders of modern jazz and the Black Islamic movements transformed the musical and religious identities of Black communities in the northern cities of the United States. This era of migration, urban religion, and musical creativity also witnessed a change in Black masculinities and femininities expressed in the programs of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Nation of Islam, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Sunni Islam, and the Black Atlantic coup that provided performative structure and aesthetic shape to both Black religion and jazz styles. Black musicians infused jazz with cool during their performances in clubs, dance halls, and jazz sessions, and as they performed for Muslim communities in various cities. They also interfaced with the programs of Muslim communities to consider conversion to Islam in the 1940s and the post-World War II era. Black Atlantic coup emerged among the self-determining musicians as an alternative musical and spiritual vision, characterized by an embodied, transcendent, and purifying African diasporic mode of style, performance, self-composure, social balance, and resistance that shaped the construction of Black identities and religion and music and created some of the most beautiful music in the United States in the 20th century. This book also traces the history, experiences, and identities of diverse African American Islamic groups from the 1940s to the 1970s, including some whose practices and theology did not conform to the beliefs of Sunni Islam. Black Muslims dazzled the United States with their new communities in the urban North, communities that encountered the successive presentations of Islam during the Great Migration. This book reveals how new constructions of Blackness and religion in the Nation of Islam interacted with the differing versions of Islam shaped by the transnational Ahmadiyya Muslim community from India and the Sunni communities in the United States, and how the debates among the proponents of Islam in Black America influenced the religious and musical landscape of jazz. Ahmadiyya Muslim missionaries were exemplars of transnationalism. They circulated their religious message widely across a range of countries, including India, Pakistan, England, Ghana, and the United States. And their mission to Blacks in the United States transformed the meaning of conversion among African-American jazz musicians, especially in Dizzy Gillespie's big band. Communities like these relied on global networks created by international migrants whose spiritual and political identities were shaped by their travel and by their religious connections to both their countries of origin and their communities in their host countries. John Coltrane, who was born in North Carolina, was at the forefront of those Black American musicians who infused jazz with Islamic themes and with musical and religious forms from regions spanning Africa and Asia. And Malcolm X, who was born in Michigan, but also spent a lot of his teenage years in Boston and New York, led a movement to connect Black American liberation to religion and politics in the Third World. Coltrane openly admired Malcolm's internationalist political and religious perspectives, and we know this now from a lot of new interviews that are now available that were done with John Coltrane, and also from interviews with Muslim musicians that have recently become available, people like Yusef Lateef, who knew Coltrane very, very well. Coltrane's conception of jazz was deeply influenced by Islam for a while, and he considered converting to the religion when he was living in Philadelphia. And that was a period of time when he was married to his first wife, Naima, who was a practicing Muslim. Malcolm was a Lindy Hopper star in Boston and New York in the 1940s. He loved jazz and was involved with Muslim communities during the rise of African-American Islam. And these were interactions that influenced his own youthful musical and religious expressions. I make the point in my book that John Coltrane and Malcolm X were jazz brothers in rhythm and spirit. They lived during the global era of Black liberation that spanned the period from World War II to the very beginning of the Black Power movement. During this period, hundreds of jazz artists were influenced by Islam, Christianity, new forms of jazz, and other Black Atlantic connections that linked Africa, the Americas, and the Muslim world, searching initially for personal transformation and freedom, and ultimately circulating their spirituality in national and global contexts, along with their great music. Coltrane and his musical colleagues played an important role in what jazz scholar Ashley Kahn has called the golden age of jazz, which lasted from the late 1950s to the 1970s, when, according to him, more jazz players than ever before or since were alive, representing every era of the musical tradition. Paralleling the golden age of jazz was a golden age of African-American Islam, which lasted from the 1940s to the 1970s, an era when many prominent Black Muslim leaders and their communities presented the religion in all its dynamic diversity to the United States. As a result of their efforts, Islam emerged during the 1940s and 50s as the iconic religion of Black internationalism. Malcolm and Muslim musicians such as Yusef Lateef, Art Blakey, Kenny Clark, Max Roach, Abbey Lincoln, and Etta James were the link between these two golden eras. Their stories reveal the intersecting goals and values of both Islam and jazz and offer a wide lens on this era in which musicians and their fans explored Black Atlantic performance styles and began to understand spirited connections between swing, bebop, hard bop, free jazz, Christianity, and Islam. This book explores the parallels between the social, political, and cultural foundations of both jazz and African American Islam within the broad historical context of the Great Migration, the Marcus Garvey movement, and also the impact of Afro-Caribbean communities in the big cities, especially Boston and New York in the 1940s and 50s. The story of Black Boston, which is my hometown, a community in which musicians took the lead in exploring the interactions between Garveyism, Black Christianity, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the Nation of Islam, Sunni Islam, and modern jazz is central to my inquiry in this book. The theme of Black religious consciousness also has a compelling history in New York City, as exemplified by the soul-searching performances of Black musicians such as Dizzy Gillespie, Ahmad Abdul Malik, Max Roach, Abbey Lincoln, Art Blakey, Pharoah Sanders, Ahmad Jamal, and Etta James, to name a few. This book then explores a history of this internationalist era, offering a picture in which jazz frames and reshapes diasporic Blackness, Black American interactions with Islam, and Black Atlantic religious consciousness in general. Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam leader and Pan-African convert to Sunni Islam, grew up in Boston, and during his teenage years, the city's vibrant jazz culture deeply influenced his identity. And actually, Malcolm X grew up, of course, a couple of generations after me, about 10 minutes from where I grew up in Boston. So it's very interesting. I've always felt a connection to Malcolm X because one of the elementary schools that I attended, years after he had left Boston, was across the street from the house that he lived in when he came from Michigan to Boston to live with his half-sister Ella. Even as a young man, Malcolm X strove to expand his family's Pan-African consciousness beyond Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, with its focus between World Wars I and II on Black internationalism. And he attempted to incorporate Black musical identity and African American Islam within the family that he grew up in. A little bit of a definition for Pan-Africanism, because this is a theme in the book. I describe Pan-Africanism as a modern Black consciousness promoting the global unification, freedom, and empowerment of people of African descent. Its various goals are the decolonization and liberation of Africa through means as seemingly diverse as the recrafting of African culture and identity in the African diaspora. And sometimes there is the theme of the immigration of diasporic peoples back to Africa in Pan-African movements. These ideals, global religious consciousness, and the performative practices of jazz experimentation and improvisation shaped Malcolm X's conversion to the Nation of Islam while he was in prison in his 20s, as well as his later ministry among jazz musicians in Boston and New York after his release. John Coltrane, the great jazz saxophonist, who actually came from an African Methodist Episcopal background in North Carolina, had a spiritual awakening in Philadelphia in 1957 while he was married to his first wife, Juanita Naima Austin, a practicing Muslim. He also shared cultural and political affinities with influential Muslim jazz musicians of the 1950s and 60s, many of whom he played in his band, including McCoy Tyner, Art Blakey, Yusef Lateef, Sahib Shihab, Ahmed Abdul Malik, Idris Suleiman, Kenny Clark, Len Holt, Kenny Durham, and Rashid Ali. Islam was largely responsible for shaping Coltrane's musical and religious identity and his expressions of Black independence, self-determination, and freedom, as well as his interactions with, later on in his career with Asian religious traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, that he also experimented with. Coltrane's spiritual awakening inspired his second wife, pianist Alice Coltrane, saxophonist Pharoah Sanders, and other jazz musicians to synthesize musical and religious forms from a variety of Black Atlantic sources in their performances, as well as in their religious lives. Also in the book, I do show very much at the end of the book that after her husband's death, Alice Coltrane went in the direction of Hinduism and became very, very deeply involved in that religious tradition for the rest of her life. Coltrane's iconic performances, his albums, especially A Love Supreme and his spiritual quest in the 1960s, fostered awareness of the enduring connections between music, religion, and freedom in the United States, the global African diaspora, Asia, and Africa, connections that paralleled Malcolm X's internationalist perspectives on Black liberation in the last year of his life after he left the Nation of Islam and converted to Sunni Islam. Coltrane's jazz then provided a soundtrack to a movement, a musical iteration of an internationalist Afro-American identity encompassing race, religion, and politics, an identity that Malcolm X described as unity between Black Americans, the Third World, and Africans in a struggle for freedom by any means necessary. Another musician whose career reveals the mutual influences of Islam and jazz was jazz and rhythm and blues singer Etta James. James was drawn to the jazz brotherhood and sisterhood that Malcolm and Coltrane exemplified, and she actually immersed herself in African-American Islam, a little-known story. As a young woman in Atlanta in the 1960s, she converted to the Nation of Islam and changed her name to Jamesetta X. In 1960, while she was living in the Teresa Hotel in Harlem and performing in New York City, James came under the sway of Malcolm X. Malcolm X visited her frequently. The young Cassius Clay, who later became known as Muhammad Ali when he converted to the Nation of Islam, was one of Etta James' fans when she performed in New York City, and she actually tried unsuccessfully to convert him to the Nation of Islam when he was 18 years old. James eventually left the Nation of Islam and embraced the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, but her musical career continued to be influenced by Black Islam. Tenor saxophonist Yusef Lateef was a close friend of John Coltrane and his wife, Juanita Naima Austin. In 1948, Lateef became a devout Muslim and converted to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community because he explained, and I'm quoting him, "It taught all the virtues of being kind and respectful to your parents and others, to have feeling and compassion for the poor. When Almighty God turns a person's heart towards Islam, which is peace, there is no other choice for that person," end of quote. Yusef Lateef's Islamic faith had a clear influence on his music, on his albums, such as Eastern Sounds and Prayer to the East, for instance. He incorporated Arab and Asian musical sounds into his jazz compositions. And we also see Yusef Lateef on his early albums wearing a kufi and identifying himself through his through his style and what he is wearing as a Muslim. My book tells the story also of the jazz musicians who used their participation in America's Cold War diplomacy cultural programs to foster connections among jazz, Black internationalism, and the transnational reception of African American culture in the Islamic world and Africa. The US State Department jazz tours began in 1956 during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they continued into the 1960s during the era of anti-colonialism, African independence, and civil rights. The African American artists dispatched in these tours, including Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, and Randy Weston, played their music in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and their performances and political insights celebrated transnational musical collaborations with third world musicians and the liberation struggles raging across diverse countries in the Islamic and African diasporas. And I'll just take a brief drink. And I'm coming close to the end where we can have some discussion. This era also witnessed the dynamic connections between Muslim jazz artists' spiritual journeys and the way in which their iconic performances of jazz, their belief and love of Islam, and their projection of Black internationalism intersect with one another to create rhythms, sounds, rituals, and memories evoking the legacy of Africa, the global African diaspora, and the Black liberation movement in the United States. Only a few jazz musicians, including Yusef Lateef, Ahmed Abdul Malik, and John Coltrane, achieved the ambitious goal of connecting the dots between their religious discipline and their musical performance practice. Africa spoke, and America answered with the Arab music of Abdul Malik on his album Jazz Sahara, and Max Roach's and Abbey Lincoln's We Insist Freedom Now suite with Nigerian drummer Babatunde Olatunji in the 1960s was an important example of two Sunni jazz musicians who were married to one another, who were very religious people, and at the same time, they expressed their political goals of Black liberation and their spirituality on a very important album that was central to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The performances of these Muslim jazz artists exemplify and circulate Black Atlantic world visions of Africa, the diaspora, and racial identities in the United States, showing the creative resistance strategies of Black Americans that were nurtured by the extraordinary urban jazz and Muslim communities that thrived in many American cities from the 1940s to the 1970s. And I make the point in this book that this was a period of time in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where Muslim missionaries were a part of the everyday urban landscape for Black Americans. I grew up in a community in Boston, Massachusetts, where this was the case. And also, this was a period of time when many of the great jazz musicians were very accessible to ordinary people. They intersected in various ways with cultural centers and in African American communities in major East Coast cities. Finally, an understanding of shared Black global connections in this period reveals how much jazz musicians contributed to the development of a new diasporic Afro-American identity in the 1960s, in which Black Americans were shifting from, an understanding of themselves as colored people and Negroes to a new understanding of themselves as Afro-Americans. Of course, that identity taken from Malcolm X's short-lived human rights group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The Great Migration, immigration from the Caribbean and West Africa, and the global travel of jazz musicians fueled dynamic interactions between Islam and jazz in Black communities of cosmopolitan cities, especially Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where both Malcolm X and John Coltrane lived and intersected with one another. A focus on Black internationalism allows us to map the thematic links of jazz and Islam to Black power, civil rights, human rights, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and anti-colonial movements in Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. Black internationalism also prompts an investigation of constructions of diaspora, which recall some of Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic reflections about race, enslavement, and modernity in Caribbean, British, and Black American contexts, and the way in which these themes find expressions in subversive musical sounds and identities. Malcolm X's and John Coltrane's quintessential meditations on Islam, jazz, and Black internationalism across space, time, and soundscapes resonated with the spirit of Afro-American freedom and identity during the Civil Rights and Black Power era, a period that saw similar Black Atlantic liberation and identity formation movements in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Third world consciousness was a pivotal spiritual and political philosophy for Malcolm X and John Coltrane in 1964, an iconic year when their parallel religious and artistic paths intersected profoundly with one another in a creative way that would ultimately shape African-American Islam and jazz. For in this year, John Coltrane composed his Islamic-inspired album, A Love Supreme, and Malcolm X performed the Hajj in Mecca, became a Sunni Muslim, and articulated his jazz story and his journey to Sunni Islam in the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was published after his death in 1965. Coltrane, unfortunately, died very young on July 17, 1967. Like Malcolm X, he was just close to 40 years old when he died. Jazz scholar A.B. Spellman wrote about Coltrane's passing, and I'm quoting him, "A man like Coltrane was playing about something consciously Black, no matter how abstract his formulations may be," end of quote. His music, Spellman explained, created a revolution in sound that can feed organically into Black people's lives, end of quote. As for Coltrane's Islamic and African connections, he had formed a musical group with Babatunde Olatunji, the Nigerian drummer, and Yusef Lateef, and they had planned to travel to Africa in the last year of Coltrane's life. And actually, in the last year of Coltrane's life, he had made arrangements to have a group of concerts with Yusef Lateef at Carnegie Hall and other places in New York City, and actually Yusef Lateef had turned Coltrane on to his real estate agent, and Coltrane was planning to buy a space in New York City, which would incorporate Islamic values of purity, where Men, women, and children could listen to jazz, which was to Coltrane sacred music without alcohol and drugs, where you could listen to jazz, drinking tea, drinking coffee, eating cakes. Malcolm X, John Coltrane, Max Roach, Abbey Lincoln, Etta James, Yusef Lateef, McCoy Tyner, who was Coltrane's pianist and was an early convert to Islam in Philadelphia, and several others committed their lives to exploring Black Atlantic religious and musical forms. In doing so, they spoke eloquently to diverse communities throughout the African and Islamic diasporas in ways that allow us to understand their political and cultural connections to one another and to Black revolutions in the United States and Africa. Their religious practices and musical performances express the vitality of a new Afro-American racial identity in the 1960s and 1970s, and continue to provide insight into the Black international experience in African American Islam and jazz in the 21st century. In short, Muslim jazz artists search for new ways to express Black affirmation, self-determination, freedom, and Black internationalism, as well as their opposition to systemic racism, speak profoundly and universally about the loftier possibilities of the creative imagination and the power of the human spirit. And I'd like to end this part of our session with a few lines from Coltrane's Islamic-inspired album, A Love Supreme. No matter what, it is with God. He is gracious and merciful. His way is in love, through which we all are. It is truly a love supreme. God breathes through us so completely, so gently, we hardly feel it. Yet it is our everything. Thank you, God. May we never forget that in the sunshine of our lives, through the storm and after the rain, it is all with God in all ways and forever. With love to all, I thank you. And I'll end there.